Hey, BookTube. Yes, I know it's been a while. There's reasons for that, though, uh, but I won't get into that now because I want to do a video on a book that I've been reading, and I finished about a week or two ago, and I've just been thinking about it, reading other material on it, and I wanted to talk about just my general thoughts about it now. Now that I've had a week or so to think about it and just turn it over in my mind because it was a great reading experience. It's The Faerie Queene by Edmund Spenser. This is a massive, fat poem, like over 1,000 pages at least. Um, and it's a poem by Edmund Spenser written in the 1590s, or at least published in the 1590s. And it's basically a chivalric epic, or a chivalric romance, and which is knights in shining armor and uh, like damsels in distress, uh, giants, uh, jousts, and all the kind of trappings that you would expect from chivalric romance. But what Spencer does with it is very interesting because he says in a prefatory poem, or not poem, prefatory letter in the very beginning, that he chose the trapping of chivalric romance on purpose as a vehicle to forward moral ideas, or for moral improvement, or like virtues. So the book very much centers around uh, certain virtues. And but before I get into that deeper, I just want to talk about the poem as a structure itself. It's separated into 6 books, and each book has its own virtue as its central narrative. So the whole point of choosing a virtue for each book is to show off all the aspects of that virtue. So from its excesses to where it's almost completely absent, to the common, or at least the common in this time, the idea of the virtue, the ideal manifestation of a virtue is in between. So then you have, for example, Holiness is the very first book, and the first book of the Faerie Queene is by far, well, maybe not by far, but it is certainly its most famous book, because usually when people read the Faerie Queene, maybe the first book is as far as they get, and it's fairly self-contained as a narrative in itself. And we follow a knight called Redcross Knight, who is who's a new knight. He's just recently been knighted, and he's on his very first quest with a woman named Una, a maiden, who her family's kingdom has been plagued by a dragon, and Red Cross Knight's quest is to fight that dragon. But we get a lot of adventures in between, like Una and Red Cross Knight get separated for a while, and we get both of their individual adventures, and it's a lot of fun to read this book, which is not what you would expect from an epic poem from 400 years ago, or and especially one that claims to want to actually preach to you, like a didactic poem, where they're actually Spencer is deliberately trying to shove his ideas of morality into your face, which is something that was a lot more normal at the time. And actually, if Spencer didn't do that to this poem, he would have been criticized quite a bit, I think, because I think in the beginning of the second part of this book, so basically the book was published in 2 parts. It was published, the first 3 books were published first, and then the second 3 books were published at around 5 or 6 years later. And then the preface to that second part, which is like a small, what is it called, a proem? It's Preom. he actually says that how he was criticized because he wasn't moral enough, or at least he wasn't explicit enough in his morals. And because some of the events in here can get quite racy for a book this old, um, at least in a very Christian, Protestant time period in British history. Uh, so, and what I what I mean by that is that you go on a lot of the normal adventures, but there's also a lot of like magic and deception and a lot of characters doing very weird, countering weird things. And like for example, what is an example I can come up with? How about the starting of book three? Book three follows the night of Britomart. Britomart. She is a lady knight, so a knight who's, oh, of course, a woman, but no one really knows that until she reveals herself. Like takes off her helmet, and in the very first uh, canto, which each book is divided into 12 cantos, and they're quite long. They're like uh, 40 to 80 stanzas long. Uh, and in the first canto of that one, Britomart goes to a castle to rest up, because that's what an errant knight does. When if you know the idea of an errant knight, they're just wandering looking for adventures, or they have a quest, and when it's time to sleep over for the night, like to go to bed, they just find like the nearest house or the nearest place that's willing to let them in, and they stay there for night. And it's very much predicated on hospitality. And then the place where she goes is a castle that's run by a woman who is very, um, or who becomes very attracted to Britomart and has a lot of lust for her. So then we get a whole scene of how lustful she is, and then how she, during the night, she sneaks up to Britomart's room and like tries to get into bed with her. And but Britomart, of course, is um a knight who's always on edge, so of course it doesn't work, and she ends up slaughtering a lot of the people there, because the lady of the house, of course, is full control of a lot of the knights in her own courtly castle. And but you also get other scenes of like one where this woman is seduced by another knight away from her husband, and the knight ends up abandoning her when he loses interest in her, which he's an image of a bad knight, which we get a lot in here. We get a lot of good knights, but you get a lot of bad knights too, and that's part of the whole play of the morals that Spenser toys around with. And it's really funny because when her husband goes looking for her, because he ends up finding that knight, and the knight says that he basically abandoned her. So then he's looking for his wife, and he finds her uh, with a bunch of uh, mythological creatures. Was it satyrs or satyrs? Satyr. They're, I think they're like those goat-like humanoid creatures in mythology, and she basically fell into a crowd of those, and they're like singing and dancing and whatnot, um, and she's just having a blast with them, and he's watching all this, but then finally when they repose for night, she sleeps with like seven different satyrs during the night, and he's burning with jealousy and rage, and he tries to sneak up, and he like sneaks up to her during the night when she's finally sleeping, tells her that he's there and if she'll come back with him, and she just basically refuses, just tells him no, and then he like runs off in despair and ends up in another series of misfortunes. But these are the kinds of things that I never would have expected in a poem like this. Um, but even then, it is still quite, and those are the interesting moments. But he's got uh, a lot of didactic teaching in here too. Um, he does like to give his own, or at least the voice of the poem, whether or not that's Spenser himself. Um, the narrator likes to give his own opinion on certain things that happen, and each canto basically starts off with a stanza or two on some general theme that'll be relevant to the actual canto, the events of the canto. Uh, and I guess I should show what the poetry actually looks like. It's not just one line, it's you got all stanzas, so it's 4 stanzas per line or per page. And this is a very particular poetic setup that um, Spenser himself basically adapted for his own use. Like I think he either created on his own or he adapted it. Previous like similar poetic techniques and just made his own to fit this. So each stanza is its own thought, and it's got a period at the end, so it doesn't continue. Like um, when I read Milton, it's just all a line. I don't have a copy of Milton nearby, but it's all just runs down the page with few stoppages, and you don't really have those gaps in between. You don't have stanzas in Milton. Um, but yeah, this is a very unusual book to read. Uh, and it was an unusual book for me to read too, in the sense that I've never really gotten. I've never been much of a poetry person until recently, and and sure, I read Milton completely, and I've read translations of Homer, but I read Milton. That was more of kicking and screaming kind of thing. I had made a deal with a friend that we could choose each other's next reads, and for some reason she chose Milton for me, and I begrudgingly went into Milton thinking I would hate him and ended up loving him, so that was a plus. But just poems in general, I find that shorter poetry, the more elusive it gets, the less I end up understanding it. And so narrative poetry I find is something that I really enjoy and something that I get a lot out of. Even though my reading of this wasn't even smooth sailing all the way. So I read the first 400 pages or so, which is just slightly into book 3. I read those last year. I was buddy reading them with a friend. We both agreed to read this book. And it was taking me a really long time. I think it took me about a month to get through only 400 pages of this. And I was quite impatient to get onto something else. At the time, I didn't read more than one book at a time. Maybe I had another book going. I don't know. I don't remember. Probably not. Um, but uh, so I stopped right before I went back to school because there's no way I was going to read epic or narrative chivalric poetry during the school year when I had other things due. This is not a book that you want to sit back, or at least at the time, it wasn't a book that I would sit back and relax with. It was more of a challenge because he's very archaic language, a very distinct poetic style that takes quite a lot of time to get used to, at least it did for me. But this year I came back to it because I had DNF'd it last year and I was determined that this year I would finish it because my experience wasn't terribly bad, and I wanted to honor the buddy reading, even though my friend ended up finishing it last year. I wanted to go back and just finish it and chat about it. And so that's what I did. I went back to it this year, and immediately, as soon as I restarted book 3, and I just went on from there, and it was honestly 100 times better than what I recall from reading it last year. And I really found a lot of enjoyment in the verse and the story, the way Spenser tells his stories, um, the way Spenser's like his cadence, his rhyme scheme. It just all worked for me this time, and especially the archaic language. I just loved it. For the longest time, when I'm reading other things now, I have to actually tell myself not to pronounce the ed. Like when you have the ed at the end of a word in Spenser, you have to pronounce all of those to add that extra syllable. And uh, now when I'm reading other things, I have to consciously combine that into the actual word and not add that extra syllable. And it's things like that that I really really enjoyed about this. And this year, it took me just over a month to read the final 600 pages, and I would say Spenser did become very calming reading for me at that time. Uh, like where I could just sit back and relax because his adventures are so interesting. You just open it up and I just sit back and I sink into the story, sink into the verse. Because honestly, a couple years back, I read Thomas Mallory's Le Morte de Tour, and I struggled with his writing there, not with so much understanding with what was being said, but thinking the story was quite boring because it just was so repetitive, and um, a lot of the characters just didn't seem to have a lot of meat on the bone. Like they weren't actually interesting characters, and it just seemed like very conventional way of and an interesting way of telling stories. But then with this, even though it is a sort of Arthurian-like, it isn't strictly because Arthur is in this story, but he's Prince Arthur, not King Arthur. So he's just another errant knight, but he holds a very special role. But comparing this to Mallory, I found the sweetness of the verse and just the consistency um, of the rhyming and the just the whole idea of narrative poetry added a, a ton to the story. Because I find like if the same story, if everything in here was written as, say, Thomas Mallory were to write it, or just written in prose in general, I would find it would lose a lot of its interest to me. It'd be interesting in its own right, but it wouldn't be the classic that it deserves to be. And it it wouldn't have the skill and the deftness of, or because it's difficult to say what I mean, because it still boggles my mind how much skill it takes to tell the story in the way he does. Because of you see all of that, each line and each stanza, it takes a lot of skill to limit your story to each stanza and to actually have a coherent, flowing narrative. And this year, I started for the first time, or at least I tried for this first time ever, to actually write a poem. I tried to write an ode, um, and it just added a lot of appreciation to how actual poets work, because nowadays it's very fashionable not to have your poems rhyming, but I wanted mine to actually have rhymes in them. And just like the whole idea of the cadence of each line, followed by each line rhyming, and actually having it make sense. I was splitting synonyms a lot more than I should have, and it seemed like I was finding, instead of trying to actually say what I wanted to say, or I was being frustrated with what I was trying to say versus what the limits of, or the constraints of the poetic form actually allowed me to say. But Spenser is just so effortless in that, where I know exactly what he's saying most of the time, and even with the archaic language, and he molds language, and he um, and yet he's playful and entertaining, and all of these interesting ways in which he conveys his story through the medium of verse that he chooses. It adds a lot to the story, and it's not something that uh, I take lightly as something that just anyone can do. Um, I'm gonna and since I've read the Faerie Queene, or I've been reading some other stuff too. So on my e-reader, I have this. I don't know if you've heard of Routledge or Routledge. I don't know how to pronounce them. They're like a very expensive academic press where they have a lot of um, just basically scholarly books. So books that are made for scholars, that are printed for scholars. That's what they usually publish with this press. They don't usually have a lot of popular editions. I do have a. I found a book of theirs because I have because part of my university subscription is that I have access to a ton of their PDFs of their scholarly books for free, and I found one of an introduction or to each chapter or each book of the Faerie Queene. It's just called the Faerie Queene. It's by Humphrey Tonkin. I believe it's from the 70s or 80s. It's a study of the I. It's a study or introduction, however you want to call it, to the Faerie Queene. I've been reading selections in here. Right now, I've been reading in his discussion of book 3, which adds a lot to my understanding of the Faerie Queene, because one thing about the Faerie Queene is that it's not just a chivalric or moral tale. It's an allegory to Britain, or to British and Tudor history more generally, because the whole purpose of this book was to get courtly favor. Spenser wanted and he dedicated this to Queen Elizabeth I, and he wanted courtly favor with her. And he adds a lot of British history and a lot of allegory of historical um, British history into it. I don't know how else to say that, and I don't catch a lot of that stuff unless it's very obvious, because I was just going for the story. And this guy catches a lot of that stuff and he conveys it, but he also does a lot of what I mostly enjoy when I read works like this, works where they discuss the actual book in question, is a lot of the interpretive and analysis of through the sources that Spenser uses, or through the or just how he characterizes his own world, and through like internally within his own structure, and how that all works out. I found a lot of it quite fascinating. And I've also gone to my Norton Critical edition of Edmund Spenser's poetry. I was lucky enough to find this used. This is the second edition, and if you are familiar with Norton Criticals, they come with essays in the back. And this includes a generous selection from the Faerie Queene, but it also includes a lot of his other poetry. I believe he's got the Shepherd's Calendar, uh, yeah, some other poetic works too that are famous from his. So not all of the critical material is about the Faerie Queene, but a lot of it is, because that's his most famous work. So I've been reading through some of that lately, and quite enjoying it, actually. Especially there is one of them in general. What what is it called? Yeah, I should have pulled it up here. It's John Hughes from 1715. He writes Remarks on the Faerie Queene. It's like an essay that was included in a collected works of his from the 1700s. And listen to how he compares, how he talks about, or discusses Spenser. He says the author seems to be possessed of a kind of poetical magic, and the figures he calls up to our view rise so thick upon us that we are at once pleased and distracted by the exhaustless variety of them all, so that his faults may in a manner be imputed to his excellencies. His abundance betrays him into excess, and his judgment is overborne by the torrent of his imagination. Where do you get critical writing like that these days? If it is there, I'm not seeing it, but I find just old insights like that just absolutely wonderful to read. Uh, and there's more like that in this volume because it goes from just after Spenser's period to the 20th century when you have a much more of a critical explosion of his writings or of the studying of Spenser's work. Um, and I know, yeah, and so I have quite a bit left to read, but I'm not sure if I'm going to read all of it or not. I'm just enjoying what I've been reading so far, and whether or not I'm not. This is a full book, but I'm not reading it front to back. I haven't actually read his discussions of books 1 or 2. I'm just starting in book 3 because that's where I started this year. I reread where I had read in book 3. I'm just continuing there, so it's fresh in my mind. I do have one more thing to say about the Faerie Queene. I would say, despite having started in book 3 and continuing to book 6, I think book 2 is my favorite. That's the Virtue of Temperance in Sir Guyon. I think Sir Guyon is my favorite knight in this book, and it's and if I were to say why, I'm not sure if I could give an insightful answer as to why, other than I found that his journey, with all the uh, side quests or adventures along the way until the very end, just how it all wraps up and how it ties with a bow at the very end. It's all very compelling to me. It's one of the clearest structured books because with Spenser, the first 2 books are quite structurally conservative and they follow one knight going on side quests, leading up to and going on like a personal moral journey, to the very end where they encounter the manifestation of all the opposites of the virtue that they represent. So like this grand vice through this character or through the character's palace or whatever, and then they defeat it, and then through the hero. But Spenser largely breaks with that after book 3. So then so the structure of the poem gets a lot more messy after book 3, where he starts numerous different tales with different adventures with different characters, and he only wraps them up in different books, and so they're not as neat as the first 2 books. And I don't know, maybe I need to reread it again to know for sure, because I definitely see myself rereading this and coming back to lots of it, because it's such a compelling work once you get to know everything, or get to know his writing, and just appreciating the poetical form. But yeah, those are my thoughts on the Faerie Queene. Not a very structured one. I should have structured that better. I could have structured that better because there was a lot of stuff I wanted to talk about, and I ended up touching on a lot of that, but in a very messy, rambly kind of way, which is, I guess, characteristic if you haven't done this for quite a while. So, anyways, that'll be it for now. We'll see you later. Thanks, BookTube.